It's not the thing. Okay. So, there we go. Last month, we talked about the end of Hebrews chapter 10. And if you remember, we have this very vivid imagery about those who would go back on their faith in Jesus in Hebrews chapter 10. We have this section towards the middle of the chapter where we were talking about helping each other to hold fast, helping each other to draw near to God, helping each other to essentially stir one another up to love and good works. We talked about all those things, but then it transitions into think about what happens if instead of doing that, which is what you're called to do, you go back on everything you've committed to and you turn away. That's exactly what the audience is facing, right? That's the choice. Either we are going to stick with our commitment to Christ, or we're going to go back on everything and we're going to abandon him altogether. And the picture that he paints specifically is the idea of trampling underfoot the Son of God. Think about if you were up for execution and someone stepped in and was executed in your place, and instead of, remembering that person every day and thanking them for what they have done, even though they're not there to thank personally, instead of that, as soon as they cut the body down, you just literally trample them under your feet. That's the imagery that's being given there, if you turn away. But that concludes this section of Hebrews. And I say this section, not just the section on sacrifice, which is what chapter 10 finishes up, but the main body of the book of Hebrews. We talked about how Jesus is the better lawgiver. He's the better high priest. He's the better covenant, or he brings in the better covenant, and he is the better sacrifice. But all that's now been wrapped up. So what we have in the next few chapters that we're going to start on tonight is we have kind of a summary of the themes that we've been going through. Even though the main idea is Jesus is better in all these different ways, if you remember, the themes that have run through every section of the book are faith and faithfulness. So now we get into Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to start talking about faith more specifically. Now, anyone know how we sometimes refer to Hebrews chapter 11? Any titles that you've heard before? Faith chapter. Any others? Hall of Faith or Hall of Fame of Faith. Yeah. This is a well-known chapter in the Bible for a good reason, right? There are so many inspiring examples of faith that are listed in the chapter. But I hope as we go through, and we'll probably spend at least 2, if not 3 weeks going through, because it is a long chapter and there's a lot here. But I hope that we will get a sense of what the author is trying to do in the big picture here. He's not just giving us a list of names just to give us a list of names. He's trying to accomplish something very specific in how he does this. So we're going to start in. We're only going to get to the first 7 verses tonight, but we're going to start in Hebrews chapter 11. But before we read the text, we need to ask a question. Now, we've addressed this some in not only other studies, but of course, and somewhat in our study of Hebrews already. But we need to ask this question as we talk about faith. What is faith? If we had to define it, what is faith? And don't you start quoting verse 1 to me, okay? That's not what I'm asking. What is faith? Okay, believing something will happen. I like that phrasing because it implies 2 things. Belief, we've talked about several times before, the word believe in English and the word faith, they're the same word in the Greek. So believe essentially is the verb form and faith is the noun, right? But they're the exact same thing. But you say believing, not just believing something will happen. Now I think that is a part, I think we could say maybe that that's not the only part of faith, but it's certainly a part of faith. Something will happen, what does that imply? It's the future. It hasn't happened yet, right? What else? How else would we define faith? What else would we kind of put in that definition? Talk about things happening, but Take, for example, our faith in God. We believe in God, but God's not something that will happen. So what else can we say about faith?
Assurance.
Okay, assurance. I can be assured of what? Okay. Assurance in the sense of I can be assured of some reality, of some fact, of some truth. Whether that's that Christ will come back, whether it's the existence of God himself, whatever we might say. So there's the idea of assurance of something, whether it's something that exists, whether it's something that will happen. We have this idea of assurance. Now, this word is really interesting, and I just want to briefly talk about this before we move on. This word is interesting because when we talk about this word, there's kind of two ways it can be used. This word was not as abstract, maybe I should, as a word to use. This word was not as abstract as it is today. Meaning, usually today, we don't use faith a whole lot, the word faith, outside of a religious context or a spiritual or a philosophical context. Usually it's kind of in this kind of abstract metaphysical type thing. But a basic definition of faith, in one sense, could be applied to almost anything. I believe that, the world is round, right? Or I believe that the sky is blue. Well, I can see some of those things. Technically, I can't see the earth is round literally with my eyes, but I can see evidence for it. But I can see certain things, but I still believe them to be true nonetheless. Because have you ever seen something that you thought meant something was one way, and then you realize it wasn't another way, or it was another way, right? You see illusions all the time. Nowadays, you can watch a video and you have no idea if it's real or fake or AI or whatever. So there's all sorts of things, even that we can see, that we're still somewhat depending on faith to realize, is this actually real? Is this actually true, or is it not? But I would argue, as the Hebrews writer is using it, he's using it in contrast with something else. Faith as opposed to sight. Now, this isn't the passage where he says we walk by faith, not by sight. That's a different passage. But the idea is already here, and we're going to see in just a second in verse 1, that he's contrasting putting faith in something that I can't verify in the most dependable way than a lot of other things I can verify. Meaning, maybe I'm colorblind and no one's ever told me. I guess that's possible. But barring that, I can see that these benches are blue, right? So I can verify that with my senses. If I had never been in this building and one of y'all met me and said, hey, by the way, the pews in our building are blue, well, at that point, I'm really having to go off of faith because I haven't actually seen, versus me being here, standing here and seeing they are blue with my own eyes. So he's really contrasting the two, and that's particularly how he's using faith here. That being said, let's talk about verses 1 and 2. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Some translations say evidence, which I don't think is bad either. For by it the people of old received their commendation. Now, here's where we get into trouble sometimes. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. I'm just going to use evidence because that's probably the one we learned, at least as far as being quoted a lot. The evidence of things not seen. What are some ways, and I'm not saying this good or bad, I'm just saying, what are some ways you have heard this verse used before? People will quote this verse and then say what? Oh, come on. I know you all have heard it used a million times. I have. All my growing up, people will quote this verse, and then they would emphasize over and over, this means that faith isn't a blind leap in the dark. This means that faith should be based on evidence. Now, I'm not disagreeing with that statement whatsoever. But that kind of misses the point of what the Hebrews writer is saying here. Notice, faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is, this is a parallel sentence construction, right? It is the evidence of things not seen. Doesn't say faith is based on substance of the things hoped for. It is based on evidence of things not seen. It says it is the substance. It is the evidence. That makes a difference. I think you can go to plenty of passages throughout Scripture that prove that faith is based on evidence, not simply a blind leap in the dark. But that's not the point he's making here, even though I don't think the Hebrews writer would disagree with that by any means. And in fact, I think you can maybe go to some other sections, perhaps even what we're going to look at later on in chapter 11, to see that implied. But that's not really what he's saying here. Substance. What does the word substance mean when you think about something, kind of breaking this up into pieces a little bit? If something is taking a stance, what does that mean? Okay, good. Let's think about a physical object, though, for a second. We'll come back to this idea of conviction. If something is in a stance, whether it's a physical human body, whether it's a something else, like an object or something like that, what does that mean? It's solid. It's planted, right? Now, sub means under, right? Like submarine. It means under something. So if something is taking a stance under something, what does that mean it's doing? The idea of a substance, in this case, really comes down to kind of breaking that word down. It's the idea of pillars holding something up. It's the idea that faith holds up what we hope for. Faith is the evidence, faith is what we have to hold on to of something that we cannot see. Let's think of it this way. No man has ever seen God, right? John tells us that in John chapter 1. No man has ever seen God. So what do I have in the absence of actually seeing God? I have faith, right? That's what stands in the place of having actually seen God until one day, what? I will see God when this life is over. So until then, I have this thing, this tangible thing, this evidence, this substance, holding up a belief, a hope, an assurance, whatever you want to call it. But right now I'm here. I'm not at the final product. Once you get to the final product, you don't need the things holding it up anymore because you're there. That's when the bridge analogy kind of breaks down, right? But this is what we're trying to get to. Basically, this gives us what we need until we can actually get to where we need to go. In fact, maybe we could even say, in a sense, maybe where we're trying to go is the end of the bridge. We don't need the bridge anymore as a whole, right? But this verse is giving us the idea we don't yet have right in front of us tangibly what we hope for. That is, being in the presence of God in eternity. We don't have that yet. We have faith until then. That's what we have to hold on to until that is realized. We look back at the second part. By it, the people of old received their commendation. And we're going to talk about a lot of people, and so I don't want to spoil it for us necessarily. But what we're going to see is that everyone we're going to talk about in Hebrews 11, they were looking towards something, towards some truth, towards some future happening, like Phyllis pointed out. They were looking for something. They were looking towards something. They were believing in something, but they didn't have it yet. And we're not talking about just believing in God. We're going to talk about things like Abraham. Did he ever see his descendants become a great nation? No. What did he see? The faith that his people would one day, or his descendants would one day become a great nation. That's what he had until what would be accomplished was actually accomplished. Let's keep on going, and hopefully this will make a little more sense. But I just want to start off with that because that is often misunderstood. But let's keep going and ask this question. If faith is the substance, and I am helping to build the thing that the substance is holding up, what happens? In other words, if instead of simply being content with faith, I try and actually participate in the creation of whatever that faith is pointing me towards, what happens? I know it's a hard concept in this particular context to wrap our minds around. Let's say, all right, let's put it this way. Let's say Liz is going to make an amazing dinner after we get out of here tonight. We've already eaten supper, but let's just, for the sake of argument, Liz is going to make an amazing dinner after we leave here tonight. She can make some amazing dinners, let me tell you. Well, let's say she's going to do that. I have faith that she's going to do that. I have eaten her cooking before. I know that she knows what she's doing. But let's say that I decide, you know what, that's not enough. I'm going to help you cook this meal. Now, that would be the right thing to do as a loving husband, maybe, but thinking from the perspective of faith versus participation, if I help her make the food, and eventually we have a lovely meal, has something changed in my level of faith in her by me choosing to participate? The end product hasn't changed, but if I'm participating, doesn't that mean that I've created more of a safety net for myself if something goes wrong, that I'm participating too? I don't have to have as much faith in her if I'm helping. You get the point? I'm doing part of the work. If I said, I trust you, I'm going to let you cook this meal, I'm going to do whatever I need to do over here, I have to have complete faith because there's no part of it that I'm involved in. But if I help, by necessity, I don't have quite as much, I'm not having to have quite as much faith in her. That doesn't mean by helping, I don't have as much faith in her. That means I'm not having to have as much faith in her because I'm participating. Think about the situation of the audience as we're moving into Hebrews chapter 11. What is the pull of going back to Judaism at this time? What are they trying to accomplish if they go back into Judaism? What is the rallying cry of their fellow Jews? The rallying cry is, we're about to cast off the Romans, and what? We're about to build a nation that God wants us to have that's going to be our reward. By necessity, if they are going to be the ones at least helping to build their hope, they don't need as much faith in God at that point because they're taking the matter into their own hands. The Hebrews writer is saying, no, no, no. You get faith. That's all you get. God's taking care of what you hope for, but you can't put yourself into the position of actually physically doing something to accomplish that. Now, we're not talking about faith and grace and works. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like building a physical kingdom type stuff. That's not how this works. You have faith in God. God does it. That's what God has promised. By necessity, if you instead try to take matters in your own hands, faith isn't as necessary. Does that make sense before we move on? I know it took us a little while to get there. Okay, so let's move on then to verse 3. Now that we've kind of established the sense of what kind of faith we're talking about, now he's going to launch into some principles early on. By faith, we understand the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Now, something interesting about this statement. If you're not a Jew or a Christian, as this is written, do you believe in this? I'm talking about in the first century, when this book is written. Do you believe this to be true, even if you're not a Jew or a Christian? If you're not a Jew or a Christian, who do you believe created the world? Can you see your gods if you're a pagan? They appear sometimes in the way that God would appear in the Old Testament, but you can't really see them, not in the same way that you can see human beings. So this is something that pretty much everyone would agree with in principle. They would just disagree on whether it's God or the gods. So let's ask the question then. Is this true today? You see, the Hebrews writer is assuming, surely everyone can recognize that what we see around us couldn't have been created by what we see around us, right? I can't walk up to some being or entity and say, oh, you must be the creator of everything, including yourself. Well, that's stupid, right? Well, that principle is still true today. More people disagree with the principle than they used to, but the principle is still true today. The idea being, man, that animation is slow. The idea being, we don't see what caused the universe to come into being, right? Even evolutionists and atheists, they can't recreate, they'll admit this, they can't recreate the process by which they believe the universe came into being. So they still have to rely on a degree of faith too, although they would never want to use that word. But the point is, we can't see what created the world. So what do we have instead? Faith. So, we move on then to verse 4. Now we're skipping from Genesis 2 to Genesis 4. Why? Well, because you don't see any faith in Genesis 3, right? That's where Adam and Eve sinned and get kicked out of the garden. So we're going to move on to another example of faith. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So now we have Abel's faith commended by the Hebrews writer, saying that Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice, and he's saying he did it by faith. But that brings up an interesting question. Does the text ever tell us anything about a conversation between God and Abel? Abel and Cain, this is what you need to offer to me as a sacrifice. Do we ever have anything like that in Genesis chapter 4? So, how did faith enable Abel, I didn't mean to do that, to offer the right sacrifice? Either I'm asking really confusing questions or y'all are asleep. I imagine it's the former, but nonetheless. How did faith enable Abel to offer the right sacrifice? Well, first of all, God would not have held Cain to be wicked and Abel righteous if there wasn't some knowledge that they had. So either there was a previous conversation that we just don't have recorded, there was some kind of principle that we don't have recorded. But think about the principle here in terms of Cain and Abel. Both knew they had to offer sacrifice. God, apparently, we don't have any indication that God was standing right there as they were offering the sacrifice, like visible to them. They were relying on, well, I have to put my faith in what I do know, which in this case seems to be at least that blood was required, because that's what God has always required for sacrifice. But ultimately, think about it this way. Does Abel have a Bible with the Old Covenant in it to give him all the regulations for the sacrifice? No, he doesn't have something tangible like that. The only thing he has to go on is faith in what he knows from God. Enoch, by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. We're not told hardly anything about Enoch. Now, there are people thousands of years later meaning right before Christ, that tried to write a whole bunch of books about Enoch, but they don't know anything either beyond what Genesis tells us. Enoch lived righteously, we're told that, and we're told that he didn't die, which is interesting. Because at that point in time, God hasn't revealed a whole lot about what happens after death. But if he doesn't die, well, that means there's something after death. But notice, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Why? We're not told God was there with him the whole time. We know he didn't have the written law, either the Old Testament or the New Testament. What did he have? He had faith. And without faith, and this is where we get a very interesting comment. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. That's pretty straightforward, right? You're not going to find many Christians, if any, who disagree with that statement. You have to have faith to please God. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. The next part's what's interesting. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, okay, and that he rewards those who seek him. Why emphasize those two things? I mean, let's be honest. If people in the church were trying to write this verse just of our own accord, which we would never obviously want to do, but let's just say we were trying to give two things that faith involves, or that faith requires. We have to have faith in these two things. I can almost guarantee you know what the two things would be? I think the first one would be the same. You have to believe in God. The second one would be, and you have to believe in what he tells you to do, or something like that, right? That's not what he says. He says you got to believe that God exists, and you got to believe that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Why those two things? Do what? What are we talking about so far throughout this chapter? What is faith? It's the pillar that holds up something else. If you go out and you just see a bunch of pillars not holding anything up, what's the point, right? So the idea being, we've got to believe in God, right? That's a baseline. And by the way, I don't think that he's trying to give an exhaustive list of, oh, these are the only two things faith involves, right? He's making a point within the context of this section. You have to believe God exists. That's kind of crucial to this whole thing. And we don't have any problem with that with this audience, because they're not thinking about becoming atheists. They're thinking about going back to Judaism. Well, Jews still believe in the same God in terms of, one God, Yahweh, that kind of thing. So we're not talking about that. But they, meaning the Jews, they're getting things mixed up. Why? Because in their minds, you believe in Jesus, or not Jesus, sorry. You believe in God, Yahweh, but you don't necessarily have to have faith in what he's going to do, because we're going to do it on his behalf, right? That's what this whole revolution that they're trying to start is about. We're going to do what God wants to have happen. So you don't have to have the rewarder, because we think we're going to reward ourselves through our own efforts. And the Hebrews writer is saying, no, that's not what faith is. At least not the faith that God wants. Faith, yes, you got to believe in God, but you got to believe he will be the rewarder. He will reward the ones who diligently seek him. It's a big difference. Subtle maybe, but it's a big difference. So finally then, we get to verse 7. Notice how many of these things so far are knowledge-based. If I don't have faith, they're going to be big pieces of information, big principles about the nature of life that I'm going to miss. So verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Now once again, we think about Noah. as far as faith is concerned. What was Noah told? He was told to build an ark. Why was he told to build an ark? What did God reveal to him? He was going to flood the earth, right? Remember what the writer of Genesis, Moses, remember what he tells us hasn't happened yet when God tells this to Noah? It's never rained. How do you get a flood if there's not even ever been any rain, right? So what does he have in place of having ever seen anything like what God describes? He has faith in God. That's what he has to hold on to. That's the evidence. That's the substance that is there until the sight comes. He has something to hold on to until then. He says he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By the way, notice pretty much everything that we've looked at so far, we're talking about faith. But the faith always prompted action in regard to, or in response to the faith. We'll get to that more in chapter 12. We already see that in chapter 11. But this last part, as we begin to wrap up. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness, of the righteousness that comes by faith. What is going to be one of the hardest things, and they've already done it, but now they're starting to waver. What's going to be one of the hardest things to do if you were a Jew and you become a Christian? What are you doing? What are you saying by converting from Judaism to Christianity? What I've been taught all my life, what I believe, what all my family believes, well, there's something crucial they're missing. In other words, I'm saying, you're wrong. This is right, and I'm going to follow what's right. You ever see that happen today? Have you ever talked to people who say, I can't become a member of the church. My mother and my father is a member of this religious group or that religious group. If I became a member of the church, I'd be saying that they're in the wrong. That is hard. That's the example that Noah is giving, that he is drawing attention to. Noah did that. Why? Because he had faith that God had promised deliverance for him when everyone else, because they wouldn't listen, was lost. That's the same thing the Jews, the Jewish Christians in this case, are being asked to do. They're being asked to double down on the fact that we're going to go with what God has actually said, and you who say you're following God but aren't actually following the fulfillment of his law, by our actions, maybe we're condemning you. We're following an example of the heroes of faith. Who did Noah save in his 100 years of preaching? His family. Now, if you ask just about any preacher for their gut reaction to that, you know what they'll say? Man, that feels kind of discouraging. I wouldn't feel good about myself if the only people I ever converted / helped remain faithful were just my family. I feel kind of like a failure. He became an heir of righteousness, of the righteousness that comes by faith. What did he do by saving his family? He literally saved the world. That's how powerful his faith was. All he had to hold on to at that point was faith in what God had told him. He'd never seen rain. He'd never seen a flood. He'd never built a boat. He had faith. That's what he had. And that was enough to save his family and therefore the world. So, as we wrap up, this first section is emphasizing how essential faith is. If I don't have faith, I'm left in the dark. I can't please God. I have no hope for the future. Because, although we hate to admit as human beings, if we try and rely on something else besides faith, something that's more tangible, quote unquote, it doesn't actually show us the way. It certainly doesn't help us please God, and it doesn't offer any lasting hope. At best, it offers a facade of hope for a time that eventually fades away. Essentially, it's one of these paradoxes that Jesus is so fond of, right? Remember how he would say, you have to lose your life to save it? Essentially, he's saying the best way to have assurance of what is real is to allow yourself to only have something that feels least tangible. But that's what's holding up everything else. That's not to say we don't have evidence for our faith. Again, I agree with that idea. But his point is, if you try and bring something else in besides faith, and that's where you're putting your foundation on, for example, trying to build yourself a kingdom, then you're missing the point. Faith is the foundation. Faith is the pillar. And until faith becomes sight, that's what we hold on to. Just like all these giants of spiritual examples that came before. Any last thoughts or comments before we wrap up for tonight? All right. Thank you all for being patient with my scattered brainness. And now we will sing a few songs.